You know,
Mr. President, when you undertook the Berlin Airlift, did you think it involved the risk of war?
It happened, and it didn't. But there was a chance in every one of those keynote decisions of the Third World War.
In retrospect, is it not probable that the agreements about Berlin drawn up at Potsdam were loosely drawn, otherwise this situation would not have arisen?
The difficulties that were faced at Yalta, where these agreements were made, was that Churchill and Roosevelt were Russia would back out of the war and make a separate peace with Hitler. They were doing everything they possibly could to keep Russia in the war until we won it. And of course, hindsight would show that certain amendments should have been made to those agreements. But at that time, it is of vital importance that they be made in the manner in which they were.
You were speaking a moment ago, Mr. President, of attending the meetings of the Big Four. You meant, of course, the domestic Big Four.
I met the Big Four men from the Congress. For instance, that Big Four setup is the Vice President of the United States, the Leader of the Majority in the Senate, the Speaker of the House, and the Leader of the Majority in the House.
Do you believe that the policy of bipartisanship should be continued in foreign affairs?
Mr. President, do you believe that there should, in time of crisis, be at least a temporary coalition?
I don't believe in coalition government, but I believe in our bipartisan foreign policy. I think our partisanship ought to end at the water's edge all the time. I'm not very strong for a coalition government, except in time of war, when everybody is supporting the executive in his effort to win it.
I know, Mr. President, that you feel in domestic politics and policies that health and education, etc. Would you expand on this?
Mr. President, Fred, the question is,
Well, would you expound?
You're wrong. Mr. President, I know that you concern yourself to a very large extent during your administration with both health and education. Would you expound a little on those two subjects?
I've always been very much interested in health and education. I think education is the fundamental basis of any republic. When the people are informed, they usually act and do what's right. That's a Jefferson theory, as you understand it. And the health proposition was one that I was vitally interested in because I wanted the everyday man and his family to have the benefit of all these wonderful discoveries that have been made by the medical profession. But at the present prices, would be available to pay his doctor bills and pay his hospital bills, and yet the very people that would...
This then worked its way over to civil rights as you said, and our example.
And then I gather from that you believe that our example in...
I'm sure of it. I think that we...
Speaking of General Marshall, do you have any hindsight now about his mission to China?
Speaking of General Marshall, do you have any hindsight now about his mission to China?
General Marshall very nearly succeeded in his mission to China. I don't understand the general workings of what broke up the situation, except that the head of the Chinese government at that time was what I call a very bull-headed man, and it was difficult to get agreements out of him. I think if those agreements had been made, free China would still be in existence.
You have spoken of General Marshall. What is your estimate of him?
You have spoken several times of General Marshall. I know he was one of your closest advisors. What is your estimate of him as a man?
I think he's one of the greatest men of our age, and an honorable, straight-thinking, forward-acting man. He knows how to make a decision. And when he tells you anything, you know that's what he believes and what he thinks. But when the decision's made, General Marshall is a good soldier. He goes along.
Could this be because he is not a West Pointer?
Could this be because he is not a West Pointer, Mr. President?
Well, your guess getting into an argument that's been going on ever since the graduates of West Point began to function. And some of us, especially those of us who are in the National Guard, are a little bit prejudiced about the West Pointers, but there are just as many able and distinguished men who come out of West Point as there are from other places. They don't have as broad a view as the other men. General Marshall, I think, would have had that view no matter where he graduated.
When I visited you recently in Kansas City, you spoke of a bold imaginative plan.
Mr. President, when we were talking not long ago in Kansas City, you outlined a bold, far-reaching, imaginative plan for the Middle East. Would you explain that a little again, sir?
I was always interested in that position. The great Babylonian Empire and the Empire of Nineveh and the Egyptian and Greek empires all centered in the Mesopotamian Valley. It was my opinion that if proper development of that valley were made, as it used to, it would support 30 or 40 million people. There's a plateau in Ethiopia that can be developed. Missouri, raised food for 100 million people.
Of course, the Arabs would have to realize that Israel is there to stay.
Of course, one precondition of that.
But in order to achieve this, there must be leadership.
But in order to achieve this, there must be real leadership.
There must be real leadership in all these nations and in the free world generally for that to happen.
Speaking of history, Mr. President.
Biography, and you can read these things over and over, and you'll always find something new that you'd skip the first time, especially when you read it in a hurry.
Speaking of history again, which act of yours do you consider will go down in history as the most important decision?
Speaking of history, which act of yours do you think will be regarded by historians as the most important in your administration?
Well, there were so many vital and important decisions made, it's hard to judge at close range. But I think the Korean action probably will be the most important because I believe that action sustained the United Nations.
I was expecting it would be the dismissal of General MacArthur.
I was speaking specifically, Mr. President, in terms of constitutional history of this country, and I was thinking it might have been the removal of General MacArthur.
Well, I don't think when the history is read and all the facts are on the table that will be regarded as such a great decision because nearly every president in wartime has had to make a decision of that kind. Lincoln particularly and James K. Polk are the two best examples of it.
Of course, this was basically the reestablishment of civilian control over the military, wasn't it?
That's true. The President of the United States is the Commander-in-Chief of the armed forces of the country under the Constitution, and he's got to maintain that position as Commander-in-Chief. He can make and break generals whenever he feels like it. He ought to be a man who will act unfaultedly on the subject, but there comes a time when he has to assert his authority as Commander-in-Chief, and that is one of them.
How did you decide to make that decision on MacArthur, and whom did you consult?
How did you decide to remove General MacArthur, and whom did you consult, Mr. President? Right. How did you decide to remove General MacArthur, and whom did you consult, Mr. President?
Well, General MacArthur had been becoming rather insubordinate as the proconsul in Asia, which he considered himself, and when he disobeyed orders directly, it became necessary to find out the best thing to do about it. So I called in the Secretary of Defense, who happened to be General Marshall, and the Secretary of State, who was Dean Acheson, and the Chief of Staff, who was General.
Lord Chairman, speaking of Johnson's difficulties with his cabinet, which is the way that ended up, you had some difficulties with your own cabinet, didn't you?
Speaking of Johnson's difficulties with his cabinet, you had some difficulties with yours occasionally, didn't you?
Yes, that always happens in every presidential term. There are some difficulties with the cabinet. Compared with Lincoln's and Andrew Johnson's difficulties, mine were minor ones because I took care of them without as much trouble as they had.
You can stop, Marty. Keep going, Charlie. Whatever happened to the Morgenthau Plan?
Mr. President, whatever happened to the Morgenthau Plan?
Well, it was not a proper plan, and it went out the window, as such plans usually do when they're not right track.
Is the important thing what the man brings to the presidency, or what?
Mr. President, is the important thing what the man brings to the presidency or what the presidency does to the man?
It's a matter of both, but I think what the president I don't know, I maybe elaborate too much on this. Took up too much stuff.
Mr. President, in 1948, you risked defeat, split your own party on the subject of civil rights. Why?
Because I thought it was right, and I still think it was right, and the people thought it was right. And I don't think this country can have one policy at home and another policy abroad and expect to be the leaders of the free world.
Mr. President, don't try to answer these. These are just for answers.
What? All right, I'll be still.
Why?
Why?
Why was this?
Why was this, Mr. President?
Because I thought it was right.
Again.
Why was this, Mr. President?
Because I thought it was right.
Yes.
Yes.
Please continue.
Please continue.
Then, in your opinion, there's been no great change in campaigning because of the advent of gadgets like television and radio, etc.
Well, Mr. President, then in your opinion, the advent of these gadgets like radio and television have not changed the basic problem of campaigning, is that right?
I think that's exactly right. I don't think it's changed the basis of campaigning at all. A good campaigner is a man who knows how to convince people that what he believes in is right, and who knows how to make that stick and make people understand it. And it takes personal contact to do that.
You can do it face-to-face better than from a distance.
I always could. And I think most any successful politician will tell you the same thing.
Do you feel that during your career there has been much distortion in the reporting of news?
Do you feel that during your political career there has been very much distortion?
Brown, always try to state the facts as they see them. The distortion is in the editorial room with the news editor and the policy makers of the paper itself. That's where the distortion takes place. I've never fussed with the working press. I like them. I like some of the publishers, too.
What's the best method of keeping the people from believing these?
What is the best method of keeping people from believing these untruths?
That's one of the places where radio and television come in. A man can't see everybody in a country of 170 million people. He has a chance to talk to a vast majority of them, however, over radio and television and correct these misstatements in the papers, and they've become much more careful since that's been possible.
What was the most difficult selling job that you ever had to do as president?
What was the most difficult job of salesmanship you had to carry out as president?
Well, of course, the campaign in 1948 was the most difficult selling job that I ever undertook, but it was successful.
At what point in that campaign did you feel that you had it won?
Well, I had thought I could win that campaign after the acceptance speeches of Senator Barkley and myself in Philadelphia at that convention, the night the convention adjourned. The reception which we received at that convention convinced me that if we could see everybody in the country wherever we could and do the same job on them we did on the convention, that we could win.
Did you ever consider running in 1952?
Did you ever consider running in 1952?
No, I never did.
Did you ever consider running in 1952?
No, I never did consider running for president again after 1948. And I issued a statement to that effect to my staff, and they smothered it. It never came out.
Speaking of the president occupant of the White House,
Speaking of the present occupant of the White House, did you at one time advise him not to run for the presidency because the only way his reputation could go would be down?
I told him that very frankly, and he agreed with me at that time.
Is it true that you offered him?
I told him that if he was in a frame of mind to run for the presidency, he could do just like General Grant did, and in all probability could be elected. He said he had no ambitions in that direction. His reputation was made. That's an exact quote.
Mr. President, you've had military experience and training. Do you feel that our military training has a tendency to limit officers when it comes to the bigger picture?
Mr. President, you have had military training and spent a great deal of time with top-ranking military men. Do you feel that their training tends to limit their view, their interests, and their knowledge in world affairs?
I think that's the case with professional military training, because it teaches him discipline, teaches him how to take care of himself, and teaches him how to get along with other people. But professional military men are military men from start to finish, and it's very difficult for most of them to see the whole picture.
Let's go back to the Supreme Court. What did you look for in your appointments to the court?
Mr. President, let's go back to the Supreme Court. What qualities did you look for when appointing a judge to the court?
Honor and ability. I thought a man who had an honorable reputation and a good background, and who had a straight-thinking, forward-looking mind would make a good member of the court. He also ought to have an excellent legal background. That's necessary to be, in my opinion, to be a member of the Supreme Court, although a man doesn't have to be a lawyer to be a member of the Supreme Court. Did you know that?
I did know that, yes, sir. One of the few things I do.
At what point did you become calloused about personal criticism?
Mr. President, at what point did you become rather calloused, perhaps even almost indifferent to personal criticism?
I learned that in my first campaigns in Jackson County when I was running for county judge. And I've always been of the opinion that personal criticism never harms a man if he can't prove it on you. If he can prove it on you, you better look out.
It's the beginning of the second day of shooting, gentlemen, if you want to point a reference to the question in here. Mr. President, when World War II ended, our war machine was dismantled. Was there anything in retrospect?
Mr. President, when World War II ended, we then proceeded to dismantle the greatest military machine that had ever been constructed. I know that you were concerned about it. General Marshall was concerned about it. Was there anything that you could have done that you didn't do to prevent it?
I don't think there was anything that could have been done, for the simple reason that every mother and every father and every boy wanted to get home. I was in the First World War, and our main cry after the armistice was, "We want to go home." Every kid on foreign soil wanted to get back to see Mama and Papa, and every Mama and Papa was bringing every bit of pressure possible on the Congress and everybody else to get it done.
Getting back to hindsight and retrospect, what do you now think about the Churchill policy of coming up in the soft underbelly?
Well, looking at it with hindsight, is it not possible that we would have been better advised to have followed Mr. Churchill's policy of coming up through the underbelly in the hope that Allied troops would then have rested in Vienna, in Prague, and Warsaw, and so forth at the end of the war?
Well, that's, of course, the hindsight approach to the program. But at the time, all the best informed military men on our side were of the opinion that we should go in the way we did. I think probably the results as they came out would have been better off had we tried that suggestion of Churchill's, but that's only hindsight.
In time of great national crisis, have you considered the possibility of coalition government?
We threw that one in earlier, friend.
Yes.
Yes, it's been answered.
Okay. Well, this got us around to the business of any thought of the British parliamentary situation.
That's done. Mr. President, have you ever thought of the advisability of our adopting the British system of collective cabinet responsibility?
I've had it put up to me, and I've thought about it, but I've never been in a frame of mind to think that it would work in our country.
You've probably done more negotiations than any other American president. What is your technique of negotiating?
Mr. President, you have probably negotiated more agreements with foreign countries than any other president. What is your formula for successful negotiation?
Well, you've got to have a proposition to negotiate about on which you think you're right. And you have to have a frame of mind of give and take. You know in a bargain you can't get everything you want.
Okay, two cameras on this one. I wonder if you'd like to give your impressions of some of the people you've had to deal with.
I wonder if you'd like to give your impression of some of the people you've had to deal with. Let's start with Stalin.
Stalin at Potsdam, that's the only place I ever saw him, made a very agreeable impression upon me. He was easy enough to get along with. It was easy enough to make an agreement with him. Of course, I didn't know at that time he had no intention of keeping him.
De Gaulle?
De Gaulle was one of the hardest men I ever had to deal with, and it was not due to anything else except the personality of de Gaulle, I think.
Churchill?
Churchill was one of the most agreeable men I ever met. He's a hard bargainer. He likes to argue about everything, but when it comes right down to brass tacks, he's always on the right side.
Well, throw in Nehru and Chiang.
Yeah. Nehru?
Nehru is, I think, a very difficult personality. I only had one meeting with him, and when he came to visit me at the White House to discuss the Marshall Plan for India. I think he's an honest man, but he doesn't think down our line very well. He's a difficult man to get along with.
Chiang Kai-shek?
I had no connection with Chiang Kai-shek. I never met him, only through General Marshall. General Marshall's characterization of him was that he was a very difficult man to deal with.
You presided over a great revolution of events. Was this a deliberate plan, or were you compelled to do this?
Mr. President, you presided over what I think could be called a great revolution by consent in this country, to the point where our commitments now stretch out all over the world. Was this done as a deliberate act of policy, or were you forced into this by events?
It was
To buy my lot in Hollywood? And I said, yeah, I know he did. And Sam, like a little 10-year-old boy, said, you know, I offered him an option, and he wanted it in writing.
Hooray for Paley.
And I have a second reason for doing this. Would you tell the President the story of sometime when the camera's on, the story of Mr. Churchill and the British status?
Oh, yes. I'd like to tell that right now.
All right, I want to hear it. I want to hear it.
I went to see Mr. Churchill, and when I was making an arrangement for this album, and suddenly he broke off the conversation, and he said, Murrow, are you familiar with the case of Mrs. Smythe? And I was thinking furiously, and I said, no, sir, I'm afraid I'm not. And I was worried because you take your head off if you're a reporter and haven't done your homework.
That's right.
And I said, no, sir, I'm afraid I'm not. And he said, Mrs. Smythe is a female who was permitted by the BBC to broadcast, doubting the existence of God. The old man said, I was deeply perturbed, and I caused to be summoned the appropriate officials of the BBC, because I was then still Prime Minister. And I expressed to them my perturbation, and I suggested that doubt should not be spread where no doubt existed heretofore. And they said to me, yes, but we gave equal time to the other side. To which I replied by saying, yes, and I have no doubt that had you commanded this miraculous medium at an earlier period in history, in your even-handed justice and refusal to make decisions, you would indubitably have given equal time to Jesus and to Judas Iscariot.
Oh, that's a
This is the final comment on the equal time theory as far as radio and television.
It's perfect. It's just perfect.
I wanted to get that unfinished for a long time. Thank you. Okay, let's get back to work here. Keep going, fellas. One camera only. I'm only on. Okay, one camera only.
Yeah, go ahead. Hurry up.
Hurry up. There's more traffic through here than there is on White House.
No, I'm sorry.
Come on.
Go straight. Well, that's last.
All right. Quiet then. What advice would you give to aspiring young politicians, Mr. President?
Mr. President, what advice would you give to aspiring young politicians?
Oh, the best advice I can give to them is to study history. First place, they must be fundamentally honest, or they ought to be in politics. All about their local and
Okay, that's
county
fine,
government and
Mr.
so
President.
forth.
Why don't more people of ability enter politics these days?
Why don't more people of real ability enter politics, Mr. President?
I think one of the reasons is that they're thin-skinned. They can't take public criticism.
But we know that's if I cut you off, it's because
Well, I want you to do that because I never quit. You go ahead and cut me off.
What about the method of selecting the presidency? The president, isn't there a better way?
What about the method of selecting a presidential candidate?
It's been studied, and the Senate committee has out a booklet on the subject, which is most important.
Well,
It
What do you think of a system of direct primaries?
I think it's almost an impossibility in 170 million people.
Speaking of finances, in time of television and radio, aren't we likely to reach a point?
Speaking of finances, with all the expense of radio and television, aren't we likely to reach the point where the party with the most money can buy it?
I think that is possible, but I don't think it's probable.
Fine. Mr. President, what is your feeling about Madison Avenue brand politics?
Mr. President, what is your feeling about the present position where it is contended that Madison Avenue and the advertising agencies are packaging and selling candidates as they do soap or cornflakes?
I don't think it can be.
Mr. President, speaking of radio and television, what is your feeling about the contention that the advertising agencies along Madison Avenue are now packaging and selling candidates just as they do soap or cornflakes?
I don't think it can be done. You can't sell him.
Excuse me. Is it your feeling that the vice president should be the second best man in the country?
Is it your feeling that the vice presidential candidate should be the second best qualified man in the party?
I think it's absolutely essential that the vice president be as well qualified as the president. I wouldn't want to put any numbers on it. I think both of them ought to be as well qualified, one as well as the other.
Just a little more level, Mr. President.
All right.
In 1948, Barkley was one of two men acceptable to you. Who was the other?
You have said that in 1948, Senator Barkley was one of the two men acceptable to you as a running mate. Who was the other?
Bill Douglas of the Supreme Court.
When you were in Washington as a senator and as president, did you ever have any trouble with lobbyists?
Question was a little different, Frank.
Well, I think the president part wasn't there. All I have is when the president was
Yeah, wait a minute. Give me a second. Mr. President, you probably have seen more lobbyists than anyone else in Washington. What about them?
I had no there, and I was willing to see them, but I was not in the position in most instances to do what they wanted.
Who was the most effective lobbyist you ever met?
Who was the most effective lobbyist you ever met?
I got my answer to that.
That's fine,
Doesn't
President.
matter.
You gave a good answer.
Yes, I forgot.
What's my answer?
How much in the matter of
This is Truman, isn't it?
offshore oil was attributable to the work of lobbyists?
How much of the decision on the matter of offshore oil was attributable to lobbyists?
I think a great deal of it.
What is your definition of the basic difference between Republicans and Democrats?
Mr. President, what is your definition of the basic difference between Democrats and Republicans?
One's for the people and one's for special interests.
Over the period of the next 20 years, what do you consider will be the major conflict between the two parties?
Well, looking forward about 20 years, what would you guess will be the major conflict between the two parties?
It's difficult to look forward, and I've never been a prophet, but I think the differences between them will remain about the same.
Right.
Will there be an argument over the use of atomic energy?
Yes, undoubtedly there will be.
What form is that likely to take?
The same form that the offshore oil took. And that's the best answer I can give you.
Mr. President, there's always a problem with how much information the government should release. How much information do you think should be released?
Mr. President, there is always an argument as to how much information the government should release. What is your feeling on this general subject?
I think the government, particularly the executive branch of the government, ought to release all the information possible, but there are certain times in negotiations when all the things can't be released and shouldn't be.
Do you consider that radio and television have changed American politics?
Do you consider that radio and television have changed American political campaigning very much?
Only that it's made a better distribution of information, and that's important and vital and should be done.
A little more level there.
Yeah.
Speaking of demagogues, what's the best way of fighting them?
Mr. President, speaking of demagogues, what's the best way of combating them?
Ridicule.
Fine. You have a feeling that newspapers influence people very much.
Do you have a feeling that newspapers influence votes very much?
Not now. I think in the past they did.
Would you guess that history will measure your choice?
Domestic or foreign, right? Would you guess that history will decide that your major accomplishments lay in the field of domestic or foreign affairs?
I have no way of answering that because I don't know.
What's wrong with our method of teaching history?
Mr. President, what's wrong with our method of teaching history now?
They don't teach that history is made by individuals. They teach you dates and places and things of that sort.
How old were you then, Mr. President?
How old were you then, Mr. President?
When I started to study history, I was 9 or 10 years old, and from then on, right straight through.
In your experience as a leader, can you think of times when you convinced people to do what they didn't want to do? That's in response to his having said it, I believe.
Well, sir, in your experience as a leader, can you remember times when you succeeded in convincing people to do what they didn't want to do?
Yes, there are a number of times like that, and I won't go into and elaborate on them.
Ed, this question will come in the editing, I'm sure, right after he says that it was the most difficult decision he ever made. Speaking of history, would you give us the details of the Korean decision?
Speaking of history, Mr. President, would you give us the details of the Korean decision?
Yes, I'll be glad to give them to you.
Did you make a private estimate at the time of Korea?
Did you make a private estimate at the time you decided to go into Korea as to what the chances of general war would be as a result of that?
Yes.
What about the decision not to bomb north of the Yalu River?
What about the decision not to bomb north of the Yalu River?
That was one of the policies to prevent a Third World War.
Okay, a little more level, Mr. President.
All right.
What about the decision to go ahead with a hydrogen bomb?
What about the decision to go ahead with the hydrogen bomb?
I consider that just as necessary as to go ahead with the first one.
This is declarative. There's never been a new weapon that didn't eventually get to be used.
There has never been in history a new weapon, no matter how terrible, that was not used.
That's correct.
You have a feeling that